Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's virtual office hours. We are so glad to have you with us. Today's session is focused on what does it mean to lead in emergent and transformational ways. And this is the second in a series that we're doing with the wonderful organization Collective Change Lab. I'm Jennifer Jester with the Collective Impact Forum, and I'm delighted to be joined today by three wonderful folks from CCL, John Kania, Cynthia Rayner, and Juanita Zerda. Catherine Milligan, a CCL teammate who had hoped to join us today, is under the weather and sends her regret. And Catherine, we wish you well and also know we are in great hands with our colleagues today. So I am personally really looking forward to today's session. Leading in collective impact in so many different forms of systems change work is really hard for many reasons. And certainly one of the trickiest dimensions of this kind of leadership and systems change is that the work is really emergent. It's unpredictable. There are many interrelated dimensions and elements of the work that interact to create the patterns and the outcomes we see. And in social change work, this often looks like many different organizations and individuals work personally and professionally coming together, working to work their way towards a better future. And so leadership is hard. Leadership in the nonprofit sector is hard, and systems change leadership, emergent and transformational leadership is probably about as tricky as it gets. So really looking forward to some brainstorming and taking some questions on that topic with the CCL team today. So before we go any further, though, I would like to start by acknowledging the lands that we are all joining from. So we would like to acknowledge that this session is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Coahuiltecan, Tonkawa, Comanche, Lipan Apache, Massachusetts, Wabanaki, Ohlone, Coast Muckleshoot, Still-Quamish, Suquamish, and the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these tribes. Please also let us know where you are joining from today. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know the Indigenous lands that you are on. If you've joined us before, you're familiar with the two resources that are here on the screen. If not, feel free to identify the lands you're on native-land.ca or using the text service number on the screen that is a service provided by the great organization Code for Anchorage. So we'll give a minute for folks to join us in the chat with your own land acknowledgement and saying hello. Another colleague joining from Ohlone land, that's where I am joining from today. Miwok land, also in California. All right, well, Ho-Chunk, Miwok, and Pomo, wonderful, keep them coming. We also want to recognize that land acknowledgements are a very small first step to building community and relationship with the Indigenous people in our communities. The Native Governance Center is a wonderful resource that has information on going beyond the land acknowledgement. We have links to two resources here and we really encourage folks to learn more about the context of Indigenous communities that are where you are located and to think about ways to connect with and build work with these communities if they are not yet part of the work that you are doing. So as you know, today is a virtual office hours, which is about taking questions from you all. So we are in Zoom webinar. What that means is that there is both the chat box that folks are using now and the Q&A little widget module in the Zoom platform. It'll be really helpful for us if you can put your questions for our speakers in the Q&A section so that we can actually pull them out of what we also hope is a very lively and engaged chat. We have the feature turned on so you can upvote questions that you have the most interest in. And we'll try to pay attention to that as we curate the questions as well. So we are recording today's session, so you'll get an email with a link to it in the coming few days. And just a couple other notes before we turn it over to our friends at CCL. So the captions are automatically turned on. If you want them, you can toggle them on and off to your preference. The last thing I will say is that in Zoom webinar, we're having an issue with people being able to save the chat. So we hope that you all are active in the chat, and we encourage you all to share your own resources that might be useful for other colleagues on the line. We'll do our best after the session to curate those resources and share them back, because we know that you all won't be able to save the chat on your end. So we will do that on the back end and send that out when we send a link to the recording. Okay, so with that, I am going to take down the screen share, and I am going to invite Juanita, Cynthia, and John officially into the conversation. And I'm going to start by handing it over to Cynthia to provide some framing.
And
actually, I'm going to start with John.
Yep, no problem. Yeah, so we thought we'd, before we begin the conversation on emergence, begin with a centering practice. This particular practice is called 3-Sync. It was developed by Thomas Hubel. And I know for some of you, centering practice is a regular part of your daily routine. For others, it might be newer. I invite everyone to participate. It will only be 3 minutes. And I'll explain why when we're done, we are actually doing this. But I invite everyone to participate. And if it doesn't feel right to you, feel free to just chill. It's only going to be three minutes, and we'll see you on the other side to answer your questions on emergence. So if you will, begin by, just sort of settling your body. Often it helps to, if you're sitting in a chair, to sort of feel your bottom against the chair and your feet firmly on the floor. Sometimes it helps to move your body or stretch if you've been sitting in the chair for a while. We're going to, sort of try to create some awareness of the physical and emotional and sort of mental conditions that are who you are. So I'm going to suggest we just relax. If you want to close your eyes, often people like to do that. You don't have to. If you don't close your eyes, typically, staring down a foot or so ahead of your body, not at the computer screen, is helpful. So with your eyes closed or relaxed, soft gaze. On your own, take 3 deep breaths. Now bring awareness to your body, if you can. Try to feel where there's tightness, or even like where you feel good. Or if there's tingling. Sometimes even you can feel a tingling on the very crown of your head. Now bring awareness to your emotions. What are you feeling? Anne Marie Brown, who wrote Emergent Strategies, says feelings matter. They are legitimate ways of knowing. So what are you feeling in this moment? What are you feeling in your heart? Now bring awareness to your thoughts. Most of us have, it's known as monkey mind, scattered thoughts, but the mind is a wonderful thing. It's a gift. And are your thoughts a blur, just running at 5,000 miles per hour? Or can you find spaciousness between your thoughts? Now sit for a moment with the awareness of what's come up for you in your body, in your feelings, in your thought. Body, feelings, thought, do they feel coherent or fragmented? No need to judge, just observe. Okay, to close this out, I invite you to take 3 deep breaths, and when you're done with that, you can open your eyes when you're ready. Thank you. So we just did what's known as a centering practice. Some call it presencing, a presencing exercise. And being present is, critical to emergence. If your mind and your body and your emotions are caught in the past, you're going to miss what's coming at you. And if your mind and your body and your emotions go to the future, you might miss some things that say, hey, maybe you ought to turn and go in a different direction. So, yeah, this is critical to the work of emergence that we'll be talking about for the next 50 minutes. Some would say it is the work. And sometimes being present, helping yourself be present, comes through exercises we just did, generically known as centering practices or meditation. Sometimes it often comes through art and poetry and music and dance and painting. It comes through nature. All of these practices help center you in the work and center you in the present so that you're as tuned in as you can be to what's coming at you, what's emerging, so that you can step into it and invite others to as well. So thank you for doing that or participating in that exercise. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cynthia Rayner. Cynthia Cynthia's been working at Collective Change Lab for goodness, I don't know, maybe close to a year at this point. Cynthia has recently written a book that she'll talk about, which the systems work of social change, which for me was a super helpful book to help think about how one stays present in the work and what are the various ways that happens. So, emergence comes in many different sort of shapes, ways, and forms, and we can talk if people are interested about other sort of approaches to emergent strategies, certainly that I've been influenced by, and Marina Brown is definitely one. But I will turn it over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, John, and thank you for that exercise. I'm going to just share one slide. We're just going to frame the conversation with this, so it won't be very long. But what I'd like to do is just take you through a framework that helps me think about the work of social change and about why emergence is important. I think if we can kind of ground our conversation today in the importance of emergence and think about why we're even thinking about the practice of emergence, I think that will help us in answering these questions. Just a little bit of background, as John mentioned, last year, my colleague Francois Bonici and I published a book called The Systems Work of Social Change. And this was kind of the culmination of a 7-year journey to understand what was meant by the term systems change. We had started this work when the Schwab Foundation invited us to look through their database of organizations and identify those organizations that were working in systemic ways, trying to achieve what was being called at the time systems change. And it was a new term, and we were a bit interested in what we would find. What we found was that, in fact, we started to become a little bit nervous about the term systems change. We actually saw organizations that were doing what we started to call systems work, because they were day-to-day practices to respond to emerging needs born out of complexity. And these day-to-day practices were, in fact, what we realized was the real work of social change. So this idea of systems change, kind of a big picture, long-standing goal, but actually there were day-to-day practices that were allowing organizations and the communities within which they were working to address emerging, concrete, important needs as they arose. And so what we really started to think about in contrast to systems change was this idea of building responsive and representative systems as the ultimate goal. We know that there will always be change. How do we actually ensure that the day-to-day practices are responding to the needs that are coming up because of that change? We studied 8 organizations. We connected with many organizations. 8 of those organizations became kind of our beacons, organizations that we felt were really doing this work in truly inclusive and important ways. And these organizations, many of them situated in the global South, were showing to us what was possible. The orange boxes across here are the principles that we saw as themes across these organizations. These were organizations that were fostering connection amongst people, individuals, and groups that wouldn't have been together otherwise. So really creating important new relationships that were allowing the system to respond in different and productive and impactful ways. They were embracing context. They weren't trying to create cookie cutter approaches or apply things from the outside in. Instead, they were working from the inside out, ensuring that those who were living within systems were able to actually be the ones driving the change. And then lastly, they were reconfiguring power. They were actively trying to ensure that those people at the grassroots, those people who were the primary actors in the system, were those that were most powerful, were able to make decisions and were able to have durable power in the system going forward, whether that was through policy or ongoing ways of being. Underneath that, we saw very specific practices. And for us, these felt very tactical. They felt like real day-to-day practices that these organizations were doing through their programming, but also just in their way of being in the world. The first of those was cultivating collectives. So really ensuring a collective identity amongst these new relationships that were being formed in communities. They were equipping problem solvers, meaning that they were seeing those who were actually closest to the issues at hand, working in the systems. Those were the people who were the problem solvers themselves. They were promoting platforms so that there could be learning across systems, ensuring that people could actually learn from each other across geographies. And then they were ensuring that patterns and policies were disrupted, not just policies from a top level, but actually ensuring that ways of being were matching those new policies in practice. And why do I bring all of this up? All of these for me are ways that organizations were playing with, were responding to the need for emergence. These were not top-down strategies that were coming in from the outside. It was very much a way of ensuring that a system could be responsive on a day-to-day basis, ensuring that people were at the heart of the strategies of change. So that's just a way to ground our conversation. I know many of the questions have come through and we're looking forward to answering them, but I thought that would allow us to just think about why emergence? Why now? Why is this an important topic for us today?
Thanks, Cynthia. Really helpful. Thank you for sharing. And I think that does give us great grounding for launching into questions. So some of you sent questions in ahead of time, and we pulled out a couple of those to start with. And we also encourage folks to put questions into the Q&A box as well. So I'm just going to start with the first question. Balancing uncertainties and intentionality in the way that we lead. How do we ensure that emergence doesn't mean chaos?
Yeah, maybe I can take a stab, and I would love to hear all of you comment on this, including you, Jen, if you're interested in your voice. It's always welcome. So first of all, I want to say hi to folks over there in the ether. Hola, mis amigos hispanos. Hoy, amigos en Brazil. I've seen some people here from my lands, or the lands I come from, and it always warms my heart. I think that there is, looking at some of these questions, there is ways in which I relate to those questions a little bit different, given that I'm from Latin America. My experience has been a bit different because I come from maybe a culture that is maybe a little bit more comfortable with emergence and might be in its relational nature. We are tuned into that, noticing what is happening when we're in group, and when even not taking ourselves sometimes even that seriously, but understanding that we are evolving, as we are in different places. It's a feeling that also got heightened when I immigrated, right? It's a moment in which I had to truly embrace that emergence as I am learning how to be and become and belong in a different space. And I must say that there is something that arises with emergence and embraces emergence, which is also embracing discomfort. And that is something that I have noticed, that I am more comfortable with discomfort than some of my peers in this country. Now that doesn't, and I want to make that caveat, when we have emergent, there has to be a willingness to understand that we don't have everything under control, that we are expecting things not to go to plan, that we're not kind of holding on to those plans, holding on to those outcomes, as if they were lifeboats, or, you know what I'm trying to say. But they're just some guides. And that in the process, we are just, as John was saying in his opening, a little bit more attuned to what is happening around us and with ourselves as we go through our process. Now, having said that, that does not mean that it's okay to welcome chaos. Chaos can be incredibly disruptive. So there's a difference between discomfort and chaos. And the difference is that in that emergence, there's certain discipline, there's certain rigorosity to practices, to moments in which you arrive and you say, I am, either because you've done your own trainings, these are the things I need to be aware of. Because as a collective, we have realized some of our, especially power dynamic habits, that even if we change a structure, might arise. And we are rigorous at understanding when those emerge once more, and that we have the discipline to continuously self-reflect. So I welcome emergence. Emergence is a practice and discipline to be aware of it, especially when we have inherited biases towards rigidity in the structure. So I have to be disciplined at letting go of those, rigorous at my reflection, and open to discomfort. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to add some thoughts. Yeah, I think you can't, you can't sort of work in emergence. It will turn to chaos if you don't change the structure and the culture of the people doing the work. I think both are necessary. And so if you want to move down the path of emergence and you want to try to do that through sort of a conventional hierarchical structure, it doesn't work. Or a culture that values just information from the top. There are many ways to, I think, answer this. So I'll just, focus on a couple of things. And Cynthia, I'm sure you have other thoughts. But it requires a decentralized approach. And so movements, networks, collective impact efforts at their best are centralized, where information and decision-making is closest to the ground. You know, Walmart during Hurricane Katrina went from a very centralized structure where they couldn't actually affect any change on the ground to giving their store managers, you know, incredible latitude. Jane Jacobs, which some people may know, who was sort of engaged in, wrote the Death and Life of American Cities, and she talked about the wisdom of the sidewalk as a place that people randomly came together and got information from each other, and how that created a much more diverse and just, you know, kind of incredible sort of urban environment than when the city designers got together and sort of tried to design things from the top. If you're in an environment of complexity that requires an emergent approach, you can't manage through that structure. You also can't have a culture that basically, you know, sort of doesn't value being able to distribute and, you know, get information from the ground, if you will. There's lots more to say about that, but I'll stop there. Cynthia, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to point out these are great, and I want to pick up on one thing about rigor, which Juanita mentioned. I think that oftentimes when we're working in an emergent way, we actually have to have more rigor. And there was kind of this dichotomy of intentionality and emergence, but actually emergence can be very intentional. In fact, we have to be very intentional because we have to design in places, milestones for thinking, for reflection, for pivots. And I think this is where sometimes we go wrong. We think that when we're working in emergence that we're working in a chaotic fashion, but in fact, we're applying rigor to the act of learning. We know that in these moments we have to come together, we have to decide what's happening, we have to be very present in those moments so that we can see what's happening and make decisions about the way forward. But in fact, those are very intentional moments, not chaotic moments. It can feel uncomfortable. And I think that that's where Juanita's bringing up some really important notes that we can become more comfortable with these moments of discomfort if they're designed into the process, if we know that they're coming up, if we know that the things that we're going to make decisions on are coming up. I think also I want to bring up just the idea of data circulating, information circulating. It requires us to be more rigorous about how we use that information because we need to actually come together in those moments, collect the data, look at it together, and move forward. So just because we're talking about emergence does not mean that we're abandoning rigor or intentionality. And in fact, discomfort can be part of those moments. And if we plan for it, then we can actually prepare ourselves for it.
Thank you, all three. Really helpful. So now we all are bought into this, and I'm going to go to the next question, which is how do we convince stakeholders of the value of emergent collaboration when they have existing unmovable funded ideas and plans? And maybe just seeing some of the questions coming in, I would open the question a little more to say, you know, how do you convince funders to support this kind of work in the near term and to sustain it over the longer term?
Well, I'm happy to leap in, jump in with some thoughts. So some of you may have heard us talk about sort of, the frame around the 6 conditions of systems change, and the deepest sort of barrier to change is mental models, which I'm sure is not a surprise to most people on the phone. And, you know, there's always the question of how do you shift mental models? So I think you have to see this as, you know, a way, as really, you know, we're talking a worldview, right? We're talking moving from a very linear, mechanistic way of viewing the world to a much more emergent way that moves accountability from, you know, sort of outcomes to moving to accountability around learning. And so it's a worldview, it's a shift in the mental model. So then, you know, how do we shift mental models? And I'll just say just a couple of top line things about this because I don't want to go on too long. But typically we think about 3 ways that you help somebody shift a mental model. One is a cognitive shift. The second is through relationships. And the third is through helping them have different experiences. So the cognitive shift is, was I think done really well in the marriage rights movement when the shift went from sort of a more litigious way of thinking about same-sex marriage to one that was about 2 people in love should have the right? To get married. Love is love, it was known as often. And that's a cognitive shift because you're helping somebody shift their frame. Relationships is you help them be in relationship differently with somebody, with people who might have different points of view. So Palestinians and Israelis often, there are seeds of peace and other efforts to bring Palestinian youth together with Israeli youth so that they don't think of the other as the other. And that helps them shift their point of view, so relationships. And the last one is experiences. Help them have a different experience. So how can you help them sort of, engage in a more emergent way, maybe, in an experimental way with some of what they're doing versus all of what they're doing. So some thought there, colleagues, help me out.
No, that was good, John. My experience is that the world is changing slowly, but there is change. Might not be everywhere. Even, in particular with the funding, with philanthropy, there has been great shifts in terms of even people empowering philanthropy, much more diversity. I know that a lot of people down positions of power, BIPOC people in positions of power, also find themselves in a difficult situation of shifting long-standing structures and rigid boards. But it doesn't mean that it's not happening. There's different conversations. There's some philanthropists also leading the way to more radical change. We've seen it, we've seen it also with big funding happening. So I would just caveat ourselves to make sure that we don't fall into those habits of making complete statements of this doesn't happen. Everybody is rigid, everybody. Yes, most people are. Yes, that's our tradition. Yes, that's what we're used to. But at least for me, it's been helpful to make sure that I am attuned to those moments in which I start to see some difference happening. In my own work with funders, I actually, believe it or not, in a previous life, my business card said, Juanita Zerda, outcomes management consultant. So I've been that person. I love data. And yeah, I even have data charts with my kids. But and it's in many instances, I had conversations with funders where it's like, yeah, I know that you want me to do this, and I'm doing it because it's regard, but I want to also, even when I can't change the outcome, can we at least discuss if things are not going well, and why they're not going well? And I'll try to follow this out. So I have tried to have certain openness and sincerity in my relationships with funders. Not always goes well, but most times does, and even if it is in certain partnership even if at times they can't do much, but we develop a good relationship. So I would invite us all to have some courage and some hope of changing tides and try to practice that way of being emergent in those conversations and know that this is a long-term change. This is not, for me, it's a long-term change for the system. I mean, for me in relation to others as well. And just to mention to John, whatever you have under your control, even if it is as simple as how you open your conversations with your funder, how are you leading with some emergence there? So anyway, hope that was useful.
Okay, if it's okay with you, Cynthia, I'm going to go to a new question. So how might we work to name and reconfigure power dynamics, non-oppressive, when we work in emergent ways? And then there's another question related to power that came in the Q&A. What are some promising practices that organizations in your book, Cynthia, that can be replicated when shifting power structures and collective impact type efforts?
I can start. You can start. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, thinking about reconfiguration of power, I think the first appeal is to think about power in these situations as a form of effectiveness, of efficacy for the work that we are doing. If you're working in complex environments, as we've talked about, decentralization is actually the most effective way to work. And many of the organizations that we studied were actually making that case, that they could show that, in fact, the way to better operate in a system was to ensure that those who were closest to the issues at hand were the ones who were able to make the decisions. But then it would come into issues of policy and practice, who has the power, who gets to make the decisions. And in many of these cases, there were very strong activist or advocacy realms where there were pushes to change the power structures. So I think they can go hand in hand, they can iterate. What we saw were organizations that were taking a strong activist stance, advocating for policies that would allow people to actually assume positions of power that they wouldn't have otherwise. And then at the same time, trying to ensure that those spaces that were now opened up were being places that were comfortable and that were open and welcoming to those new power holders. So an example well, I'll give two examples. One organization is based in India. It's an organization called Nidan, and they were working with street workers, with street vendors, informal workers. And on one side, they were pushing for a very big, important Street Vendors Act, which was going to allow street vendors to sit on municipal town vending committees so that they could make decisions on their own about how they were going to open up space for street vending in their communities. But at the same time, they were working on the other side to build the capacity of street vendors so that they could then sit in those town vending committees and push for the policies and push for the actual new things that they wanted to have in their cities. That's one example, quite far away in India. Another example was a bit closer to home. This is an organization called Family Independence Initiative, and people may be familiar with that organization. They've now since gone global with another organization called Community Independence Initiative. And this organization has actually said, experts such as social workers, such as policymakers, have a role to play, but that role is not about making decisions on behalf of families. Families should be able to make decisions for their own selves about how they want to create the economic situations for their families. So what we're going to do is, in fact, create peer groups that are organized by themselves so that families can sit in community with one another and share things that are working for their families. And then we're going to create just a wraparound, a journaling effort so that families can journal about their experiences, share that data with each other, and then be able to look at kind of best practices across the network and choose for themselves what they'd like to do. This organization has had extremely good results by actually putting decision-making back in the hand of families rather than having it be on the part of policyholders, policymakers, and experts. Experts are still there to give support and to provide kind of the technical support, but families themselves are making decisions. So I think when we talk about power, it's really about efficacy. It's not just about something that we have to do. I think we do have to do it, but it's also about what's the best way to do this? Who are the people who should be making decisions that are going to create responsive systems?
Thanks, Cynthia. I guess one thing I would add to that is, I think this question is often asked, understandably so, rightfully so, by people who don't have the power, and sort of how do we shift the power? There's the question of how do you gain power, right? So I think how do you increase your relational influence in the system, so to speak? So finding ways to do that, to be in relationship. I don't know, Juanita, volunteer whether or not talking about CFJ might be an interesting example here.
Sure. Yes, I think I mentioned them last week and last time when we spoke, and I also have another organization that I've worked in the past around that, and it's we are at CCL, we have our own, like everyone, we have a perspective on power, and which implies emergence in the sense that power is not static. We know this. And so power doesn't necessarily just shift. You can change certain structures to even allow for people in the community to have more sit at the table or to have more decision-making ability or setting agendas, but it's not a one and done thing, right? Even with the best intention. It requires always be attentive to what emerges continuously in the relationship. So where power really shifts is in the relationship, how that relationship changes. I am very fond of Cynthia Rayner's book, Power Manual. She actually just came up today with a great blog or article in the Profit Quarterly around this. And so the locus of change of power is in the relationship. And when those relationships change, what truly ends up happening, what allows for power to be balanced to some extent, is when the values of the systems change. So that relationship allows us to see the world differently. So what grounds power shifts. So for example, to an anti-racist, liberative, principles, and that we must now hold each other accountable for. Now, the example that actually came to mind was more on an organization that actually, even in the best case scenario, is an organization who is dedicated to working with youth, justice involved youth, best intention. A lot of the folks in the organization, even in the positions of power, have come from the community, right? They were originally youth, gang involved youth, and or street workers who, continue to be in positions of power. To evolve in the organization. So this is like, one would say, perfect case. And even then, we get into ways of being that are not healthy and helpful. And there was some issues with equity and racial equity and gender equity. And, the organization, very, open-minded and interested in being responsive. We did our own anti-bias training, healing circles, and it's been like 2 years, and we continue doing this, right? Why? Because the power might be okay for a little bit, and then it changes. People might end up feeling disinvested or outside or not understanding, or frankly, something that was really truly shocking to me. One of the street workers said, okay, now that we did the circle and that we did all this, I gave you my opinion. I don't want to be sitting at the table. I don't even make the decisions. I want to go back to work on the streets and be with the youth. I don't want you to take your accountability and your responsibility for making decisions and giving it to me. So in this case, I just want us to make sure that we don't look at power as this structural change, or even just people change, that we just put people in new situations or it's one and done. It's ever evolving, because as human, we're always evolving. So I actually, I will look at the power blog in a second. It's Nonprofit Quarterly, Cynthia Rayner. You can Google it. She's written about this extensively. She has actually today just came out a blog on, but I really resonate with her perspective around power in the relationship.
All right, great. So a little bit of a different angle here. So the most popularly upvoted question is, how do you incorporate RBA, results-based accountability, into Emergent strategy? And I know, John, you said you are up for taking a crack at that one.
Yeah, and with the caveat that I haven't worked with RBA in several years, so I'm not current or I'm not aware of exactly. I imagine, I'm just not current, so I just have to give that caveat. I think it's a really good question. I know RBA has been, adopted by many collective impact initiatives, and I think RBA has had some good merit in terms of helping people try to get clear on the outcomes they're trying to achieve, and in some respects, results-based accountability is about sort of beginning with the end in mind and then working backward from that to understand sort of what, sort of the quote unquote root causes that are causing the problems that you quote unquote want to solve. I do wonder, and I think it's a question I would ask because I don't know the answer, if that is the best orientation to work in an emergent situation. I think one of the things, just to give you an example, I think when you're working emergently, the reality is what you should set some intentionality and end goals for where you want to get, and even outcomes. And you should be open to those actually changing as you learn things along the way. I will give you one example. We worked in a community of 500,000 people, and they had a collective impact effort around teen substance abuse, I think still do. And the initial goals, we looked at sort of, alcohol, meth at the time, opioids was a big deal. And they chose, because there was a crisis around opioids, and this was back in the early 2012s, really before that crisis got really deep in the United States. But they chose opioids as sort of the most, the area they wanted to focus everything around. It was interesting, they didn't choose alcohol, not because it wasn't necessarily a problem, but the social norms in that community was they just didn't feel they wanted to sort of, people were comfortable sort of drinking with underage kids, youth. So they just decided at the time they didn't want to go after alcohol. We went back 3 years later. They'd moved from just opioids to thinking about heroin, because that was an issue. And they decided, and it wasn't clear to me exactly what the impetus was, but they decided that they were ready to take on alcohol. So they had gone through an evolution in 3 years, and they had actually changed their goals. So I think if you're working in an emergent way, you have to accept that, actually you may want to change what you're doing, because as you get into the work and as you're sort of more sensitive to what's coming at you, it may require sort of that level of adjustment. Now, it could be that RBA actually does allow for that. I'm not as close to it as I used to be. I will say that I think we talked earlier about the need to establish a culture of learning and reflection, and I think RBA can take that into account. But I think in an emergent capacity, you're looking to collect information and reflect in, perhaps a more open-ended way. It's not just about why aren't you making your goal. So yeah, I think, as with everything, it's probably not an either or, it may be a both. But I think having the awareness of what RBA's strengths are and how you might want to supplement that would be important.
Great, thank you, John. Okay, let's see. We have time for one or two more questions. I see in the Q&A, Cynthia, some interest in understanding a little bit more about some of the examples that you studied that informed the framework you shared early on, and some more specifics kind of tactically around, the leaders of those networks. Do you have a sense of their costs, their organizational structure? What did they look like when they were taking on emergent strategy and emergent work? Could you share some reflections, that either specific examples or themes?
Sure. Well, one of the organizations that comes to mind is an organization based in the Netherlands called Buurtzorg. They're an organization that actually has a far lower cost structure than most home-based nursing programs. They're an organization that is actually vast. They're working globally now. They provide teams of neighborhood nurses to provide care to the elderly in communities. And what's interesting about them, and why I relate it to this question, is that they actually went from a very bureaucratic system of caring for the elderly in the Netherlands through their healthcare system to this very decentralized, run by Buurtzorg, and it actually transferred a lot of the cost to the actual distributed teams rather than having it at the head office. So what I would say is that one of the themes that we saw is that organizations that are working in emergent ways oftentimes will look less top heavy and far more distributed in their cost structure, which supports what they're doing, of course, on the ground operationally, which is ensuring that teams and individuals on the ground have most of the resources. In this case, more highly paid staff members on the ground were actually doing work that in other systems would be done by more lay people. But in this case, they put the higher skilled person into that role because they realized that, in fact, by bundling those costs and having someone at the grassroots who was going to be able to make decisions was what they wanted to do in the system. So again, more costs at the lower level, less top heavy. They show a far leaner management structure than most of the organizations that are of a comparable nature. In addition to that, a lot of organizations that we looked at had a very strong line of support in the middle. So these were kind of the overlay to support those distributed teams. So in the case of an organization based in Colombia, Fundación Escuela Nueva, they had actually a very interesting layer in the middle to support their teachers. And in fact, costs were actually not so much at the head level, but in the middle, so that they could ensure that those teachers were having the support that they needed, the training line item. So I would say that costs kind of move down. A lot of the structure is very distributed. And then learning across teams is another thing that they often invested in, creating these platforms so that organizations and their distributed leaders, their grassroots leaders, could meet with one another, travel to see each other, spend time with one another, and then take those learnings back. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's super interesting, Cynthia. Thank you. And I know many folks on the line are working, have your hat on for collective impact right now, which is many orgs together. And I'm hearing parallels around helping folks learn across organizations and creating structures, platforms for that kind of cross-organizational learning and communication that feels very relevant to the collective impact work as well. Okay, we have time for one more question. And I will go with any thoughts or strategies on what to do with a leadership team that pulls back and becomes resistant to where the work is going when grassroots efforts start to gain momentum and the work or conversations become hard and uncomfortable. And that'll be our last question.
I'm happy to jump in with some initial thoughts. One way to characterize this is that it's sort of a situation of Snapback. Snapback is a concept that came to me through Brenda Zimmerman, who is one of the co-authors for Getting to Maybe How the World Has Changed, written, I think, in the early 2000s, which is one of the best books on emergence that I've ever read. So it's called Getting to Maybe How the World Has Changed. And Brenda, unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago. She and I were writing an article on Snapback at the time, and I finally published it last year. But it's basically, we're seeing snapback all around us, right? And I think, particularly where, the snapback is the idea that the system stretches for a little bit in a new direction and then it snaps back. And so I think this is sort of one really interesting example of that, and one that's not surprising. And, in the article, we talk about sort of ways to address snapback. And to me, it is a mental model thing. And there's fears, emotions, et cetera. So again, back to these sort of three ways, and we talk about them in similar terms in the article of how do we help people cognitively, how do we help people get into a relationship differently with people that are on the ground, how do we help those that are leaders have a different experience. The other thing I would just say, from a strategy standpoint, there isn't one monolithic leader. If they're leaders, there's 3, 4, 5, or 10. And some are going to be more open to what's happening than others. So, think about the strategy of how you, work with those that are more open, that, have shifted their worldview or can shift their worldview, and then evolve that way. Don't think about it as sort of the monolithic set of CI leaders.
Yeah, Sorry, I just another resource, given that we're on the resource side, but I would love for folks to get to know the work of Harry Hahn. I don't know if you know it. She does a lot of research. She's in Johns Hopkins University. She heads the Petrie Lab, and she's done a lot of work on movement building and researching how, how do you build power? How do you truly change at large scale? And in her last book, I think her name is I can't remember the name of her last book, but anyway, in the last book, she really is researching, especially the last election. And she's saying that truly what has most success, following what John is saying, is not to have like a bunch of folks to be knocking on doors and like canvassing, like, indiscriminately, but to truly have someone who has certain relationship go out to a group of folks that he or they have a relationship with, and connecting with them and talking about different ideas. So the idea that there has to be some pre-established relationship for you to kind of be open to hearing what the other has to say is important, especially nowadays when we're so incredibly divided. So just follow John's, like, who is someone who can be, the old idea of the champion, right? And they don't have to be fully in, but who might be more willing to be open and experimenting. So that would be something that I would suggest. And the other thing, and now I'm thinking of David Hanna and the work that they've done in New Zealand. They are in David's organization is in the article we wrote for you folks and Jen and in the SIR, and is sometimes just create moments to just be in relationship, to not be about the work. When things get tense about the work and about where we're going, especially, with a lot of goals, can we just step back and dedicate time to just really chill, get to know each other, and just bring it down, just remember our shared humanity. And in this example that David shared, they were trying to solve the drug abuse problem in New Zealand, and especially with a particular gang or a community that it was gang involved, and going nowhere because they were opposing sides until, like, let's just put it down, let's just go camping together and hang out, right? And that starts to break barriers. So in all sides. So let's just not, anyway, it's just something to remember.
And I thought I'd just highlight what I thought was a very wise comment in the chat from Sheila Haygood too. I'll just read it. Understand that people process and grieve about change differently, and allow them to choose to move forward without hindering the good for all. So thank you for that.
Thanks, John. I'm going to hand it back to Juanita to close out the CCL portion of our webinar today.
So in the same space, I just would like folks, don't hang up, don't go. Yes, we're about to finish. You're going to go to something, another meeting, another deliverable, feeding someone in your house. Before you leave, just close your eyes or open it. Maybe take a pencil. And just one question. What did I hear today that allows me to be more present to emergence? Like, what did I hear, a particular thought or a particular practice that I wanted to stay with me? And if nothing is coming up, I encourage to either wait a little bit longer and just say, why? Is there anything that I'm just resisting? That's it. Short.
Thank you, Juanita. And thank you, John and Cynthia as well. I also want to thank Tracy, our colleague, Tracy Timmons-Gray, who is running everything for us today. What an excellent hour. So many great questions and wisdom on the line. And thank you to those for sharing in the chat as well. So I just want folks to know that we'll be back with John and Cynthia July 20th with a focus on how can we tell stories of systems change that are more reflective of the way change happens. So we hope you can join us, and I'm very excited for our next conversation. Thank you all.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jen. Bye-bye.